My name is Nicole Gabriel. I am the volunteer and relational organizer with the Wisconsin FairMaps Coalition, and I've been with the coalition since June of last year. And today I'm going to be presenting on our plan to permanently kill Wisconsin's gerrymander by implementing something called an Independent Redistricting Commission, or an IRC for short. So here's an overview of our agenda for today. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the IRC proposal development. So a quick spoiler alert, guys. I just want to mention that this proposal is a proposal, it's a legislative proposal. So it's not yet a bill, it doesn't have a bill number, but we have the draft completed and we have submitted it to the Legislative Reference Bureau for comment. So we're still waiting on them to get back to us, but we submitted it back in December. So when I talk about the proposal development, I'll go into where we got some of the ideas for the Independent Redistricting Commission, and just spoiler alert, the mechanics of this draft proposal, the language in this draft proposal, just the different pieces of it, it didn't come from thin air. The Wisconsin FairMaps Coalition has partnered with the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin to draft this proposal, and they have actually been working on this for almost 2 years at this point. And again, I'm pretty new to the coalition. I started last summer. But from what I know, for the last 2 years, they have been meeting regularly every Monday to discuss the draft proposal. And what they have done is they took a look at a bunch of other states that have independent redistricting commissions in place to draw their voting maps. And so they borrowed best practices from those various already existing independent redistricting commissions. So just spoiler alert, before we go over the proposal development, none of this came out of thin air. We're drawing on best practices based on how we've seen other states kill their gerrymander. So then we will also go into a very brief history of gerrymandering in Wisconsin. And I say very like 5 times just because I could probably do an entire, multi-hour presentation just on the history of gerrymandering in the US or even specifically in Wisconsin. But we don't got time for that today. So I'm just going to give you a little background to get you guys up to speed, or maybe just refresh people's memories on how we ended up where we are now. I will also go over the definition of an independent redistricting commission, and then we'll finally get to the meat of the presentation, which is the summary of our draft proposal, which you can find online on our website, fairmapswi.com. And then finally, we will go ahead and get to the Q&A section. So this first slide here just shows the names of all of the amazing women that have been working tirelessly week by week to actually draft the proposal that we are presenting on, or that I am presenting on today. So you can see that there are various ladies here from the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, as well as Yuseli Flores over here, who's the organizing director of the FairMaps Coalition. And these are some of the experts, reports, and other sources that group of ladies referred to when drafting the language of our proposal. And I just want to mention that you can see here all of these reports and other sources, these are hyperlinked. So if you have any interest in reading these reports or sources for yourself, this presentation is available online on our website. Again, that's fairmapswi.com. And if you go ahead and just navigate to the presentation slides, you can actually pull up this presentation and just click on these hyperlinks if you want to take a look at any of those sources for yourself. Okay, with that said, let's get into the IRC proposal development. So I'm going to be reading almost just exactly from this slide here so you guys can follow along with me for this one. So again, Wisconsin's IRC plan follows best practices. Experts from a national organization called Common Cause and the Campaign Legal Center studied redistricting across the country, and they created guides for what works best. In doing so, they found that only 4 states, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan, have truly independent redistricting commissions written into their constitutions. While these systems aren't perfect, they were approved by voters and are working today. In creating a proposal for a Wisconsin IRC, the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin Ad Hoc Redistricting Committee reviewed these reports and consulted with redistricting experts to determine what works best. And before we move on, I just want to point out here that we'll get into the definition of an IRC, but just to put it simply for context, an independent redistricting commission takes the ability to draw and pass the legislative maps and congressional maps, so all of our voting maps, out of the hands of our legislature and puts it into the hands of an independent citizen-led commission. And when we say that only 4 states have truly independent redistricting commissions written into their constitutions, what we mean by that is these 4 states have completely redirected the process away from the legislature and into the hands of their IRC. I get a lot of questions about, well, why isn't the Iowa model listed within these 4 states? Because that was kind of hailed as maybe the gold standard for IRCs for a very long time. And I want to say that we do have a frequently asked questions page available on our website. And if you are interested in taking a look at that, we have maybe 3 paragraphs on why the Iowa. Go ahead and just give you some, a brief explanation of why the Iowa model isn't included in these 4 states, just because that's a really common question that I get. And the reason for that is the Iowa model is actually an advisory commission. So they're not a fully independent redistricting commission. The legislature is still drawing and passing the maps for the Iowa model, but they're receiving advice from that advisory IRC. So that's why we don't have the Iowa model listed here. While that system works great for Iowa, we just don't think it would work as well for Wisconsin, because Iowa does have a long history of bipartisan cooperation, and we just don't have that same history here in Wisconsin, which has been under kind of an extreme gerrymander for the past 2 decades. So when we list these 4 states, these are the ones that have truly independent redistricting commissions where the legislature is completely removed from the process. Now that said, if you read the language of our draft proposal, you will notice that we do still have the legislature included as the final approvers of the proposed voting maps after the commission draws them. And the reason we still have the legislature as part of our process in the draft proposal, although we were looking at these 4 states that have them completely removed, is simply because our state constitution demands that the legislature be involved in that process. Specifically, it says something like the legislature is granted the ability to redistrict and reapportion anew. So until we are able to change that language in our constitution, we must still keep the legislature as part of the process. So that's why our draft proposal still includes them. We'll get into this a little later, but our plan is actually to first pass a bill and then pass a constitutional amendment after the bill. And the constitutional amendment would address that portion of our state constitution that demands the inclusion of the legislature, and then we would finally completely remove them from the process. So our plan is that we would like to have a Wisconsin model that more closely aligns with these 4 states that have truly independent redistricting commissions, but we can't completely remove the legislature until we get to the constitutional amendment step. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just dive into a brief history of gerrymandering in Wisconsin to give you guys some context on how we got here, or just some refreshers if everyone is, if folks are already familiar with this, because I'm sure I'm talking to already a pretty knowledgeable group here. So in 1971, which for context was the year Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom opened in Florida, was the last time there was bipartisan cooperation and fairness in the redistricting process in Wisconsin. Then came 1981, 91, and 2001, where lots of bipartisan bickering resulted in various battles within the state legislature. After that, we ended up having our maps drawn by federal judges, and then came 2010, but not so fast, because In 2009, Democrats controlled the governor's office and both chambers of the state legislature, which is known as a political trifecta. And despite this, they did not pass nonpartisan redistricting laws, even though they very well could have. And the reason for that is because Democratic leaders expected to keep winning and likely would have continued to draw maps favoring their own party. However, as many of us know, that's not what happened, because in 2010, Republicans gained control of both chambers of the state legislature, and we ended up with the Senate election results map that you see here on the right. So this is the part in the presentation where I pause to give special attention to this quote here. This quote comes from Cheryl Moranto, who is one of the members of the League of Women Voters Ad Hoc Redistricting Committee. And this quote is, "Gerrymandering is a bipartisan disease." And what we mean by gerrymandering as a bipartisan disease is that regardless of who is in the majority in our state, Democrat, Republican, or something else, all parties will gerrymander to entrench their political power if they are given that opportunity. Every single party will do that. And that is why we absolutely cannot give any power or any party that opportunity. So if you take a look at the election results here, this graph, it's the percentage of the statewide vote per party. And, I think we might have another black box here. Let me hide floating panel. Okay, great. So in this graph here, we're kind of getting an idea of the statewide mentality here in Wisconsin. So this graph above shows that statewide voters in Wisconsin since 2010 have been fairly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. So you can see exactly how pronounced that even split is, especially in the latter years here of 2016 to 2022. It's almost exactly even. But if you take a look at these graphs, you'll notice that since 2010, when the gerrymander was first implemented, our legislature has been overwhelmingly Republican, regardless of vote count. And the reason for this is because of those rigged voting maps, again, that were opposed after the census in 2010 and 2020. For instance, in 2022, more voters statewide chose Democrats, and yet in the state assembly and Senate, Democrats actually lost seats even though they won 4 out of 5 statewide races. I think my black screen might be back up again. Okay. Sorry, we've got some more people coming into the meeting room here. Okay, so the purpose of taking a look at these graphs here is that you can see we have a visual representation of the effects of gerrymandering very clearly here. So again, notice that in this graph since 2010, Wisconsin voters have been fairly evenly split, which is a more accurate reflection of how purple our state really is. And yet after the gerrymander was imposed in 2010 and 2020, we're seeing a huge disparity in the number of assembly members and Senate representatives that we have in Wisconsin. So now let's go ahead and fast forward all the way to 2023. In August of 2023, Clark v. Weck, or Clark versus Wisconsin Election Commissions, was filed in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed to hear this case and ultimately declared our maps unconstitutional based on non-contiguity in December of that year. And for anyone that doesn't know, that hasn't heard the phrase non-contiguity, this basically means that there were various districts in our voting maps that were not actually physically connected. So you could have one district that had an island apart from itself, kind of placed in the middle of a completely different district. So it was not comprised of physically adjoining districts, or not all of the districts were physically connected. And that's what we mean by the territory was non-contiguous. And that is unconstitutional based on our state constitution, which is why those maps were ultimately overturned in 2024. So the state legislature ended up passing new maps that Governor Evers had submitted to the Supreme Court in the Clark case into law in February 2024, and we were blessed with a brand new day in Wisconsin. So this is the day that Governor Evers signed the new FairMaps into law. And the reason I say FairMaps and not just FairMaps is because the maps were not the thing that they wanted to do was use something called the least change approach. So they wanted to change our legislative maps as little as possible. So they're fairer, but still gerrymandered, not completely fair. And on top of that, the new maps that were implemented in 2024, that only applies to our legislative maps. It did not apply to our congressional maps. So our congressional maps are still actually being challenged in court right now. And that case, I believe, is called Wisconsin Business Leaders for Democracy v. WEC. So again, this is another part in the presentation where I take a pause to say that, hey, this picture, this is a picture of an incredibly momentous day in Wisconsin. Again, this is the day that Governor Evers signed those new FairMaps into law in February of 2024 here at 9:01 a.m. And in this picture, we can actually see some members of the FairMaps Coalition. This is Carlene Beshin right here to the right of Governor Evers. She's the chair of the League of Women Voters Ad Hoc Redistricting Committee and played a huge part in how this draft proposal was shaped. Over here in the beige is Yuseli Flores, who's our organizing director. And then over here is Nick Ramos, who's the executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, who's the fiscal sponsor for the FairMaps Coalition. So again, taking a pause now to say that although this was an incredibly momentous day in Wisconsin, this is not the end of the journey for us. I like to say that this was not the happily ever after, like right off into the sunset moment that some people made it out to seem. Like for example, I think I saw one article that was titled like "The Gerrymander in Wisconsin is Slayed." And again, while this was a really momentous, wonderful day, I wouldn't say that our gerrymander was exactly slayed. And the reason for that is because without a nonpartisan redistricting process in place, by the time 2030 rolls around, we could really end up exactly where we started. Contiguous voting maps can still be subject to gerrymander. So by the time 2030 rolls around, when the next decennial census occurs, our voting maps get redrawn. So the new FairMaps that we're currently under are just temporary. They're going to expire in 2030. And if we don't have an independent redistricting process in place by the time that comes around, our legislature could just gerrymander all over again. But this time they're going to be smarter. They're going to create contiguous voting maps that are still subject to gerrymander. So those maps will be more difficult to challenge in court this time or next time. It won't be the slam dunk with the non-contiguous voting maps that we had in 2024. So it's going to be harder to challenge those maps in court, but they're still going to be gerrymandered. So that is why this was not the happily ever after right off into the sunset moment, again, that some people made it out to seem. We still have a lot of work ahead of us to prepare for 2030 when our voting maps get redrawn again, because right now we're basically we're looking at down the barrel of a 2030 gerrymander. And the way to get out of that is to implement this nonpartisan redistricting process and completely take the power to draw our voting maps away from the hands of the legislature so that they can no longer gerrymander. So if you take a look at the election results in 2022 versus 2024, you'll notice a very stark difference. So earlier on, we took a look at some graphs that show the impacts of gerrymandering. We saw how after the new gerrymandered maps were implemented, there was such a disparity between statewide voting, between how purple our state really is and how much our legislature was comprised of almost entirely one party. But if you take a look at the election results in 2022 versus 2024, you'll notice a stark difference. And this is where we're taking a look at the effects of FairMaps. Because in 2022, which is on the left side of this graph right here, and on the left side right here, we're not seeing the same kind of purpleness we would expect from Wisconsin voters because of those gerrymandered maps. However, in 2024, after the new fairer maps were implemented, we're starting to see a lot more equalizing and a lot more competitiveness, which again is far more indicative of how Wisconsinites actually vote. And additionally, there are other positives to the new fairer maps, because after 2024, when those new fairer maps were implemented, in the next election cycle, we started to see more candidates running, and we saw higher voter turnout as well. And there was more competitiveness. People could choose between a variety of candidates, so Democrat or Republican, within their district. So there are a lot of positives to these new fairer maps, and we can see here visually just how much of an impact fairer maps have on the makeup of our legislature. So what do Wisconsinites actually want? Well, we know that regardless of political party, Democrats or Republicans, 87% of Wisconsinites want universal background checks for gun purchases. 76% want increased renewable energy efforts, and 57% want an increase in minimum wage. This data is actually slightly outdated. We have some new data that actually shows these numbers are a little higher. For example, it's a little over 60% now that favor an increase in minimum wage. However, in the year 2025 or 2026 now, our minimum wage still sits at $7.25 an hour, even though the majority of Wisconsinites want to see an increase in that. And again, that's regardless of political party. And the reason this is the case is because of our gerrymandered voting maps. Because of our gerrymandered voting maps, it's been virtually impossible to hold our politicians accountable, because when safe seats are created for politicians, they no longer have to be held accountable to the needs of their constituents. Instead, they're simply held accountable. They are just focused on their own personal agenda and their party agenda. And we know that to fix this for good, we need to take that map drawing power away from politicians and give it to an independent redistricting commission in order to make sure that voting maps are fair for everyone, and we can actually see the change that we all want to see in our state and get what we need. So how do we make this happen? Well, right now our coalition is working in phases. Multiple steps are needed. The first phase is to pass legislation through the Senate and Assembly and have it signed by the governor. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we want to pass a constitutional amendment in order to fully take the power to redistrict away from the legislature. And we want this all to occur before the 2030 census. Additionally, in passing constitutional amendment, it would cement the IRC into our state constitution and make it more permanent and harder to reverse, which is why that constitutional amendment step is so important. And I am going to, towards the end of this presentation, we'll see a more in-depth timeline of what we're working with, and also we'll get into more of the details between the difference between a bill and a constitutional amendment. So I'll explain that more towards the end of this presentation. But before we get into that, now we're going to get into the meat of this presentation. I know that was already a lot of information just to catch you guys up, but now just take a deep breath, because we are going to now break down the process that the Independent Redistricting Commission would go by. So actually, if you take a look at our draft proposal, the way that I'm going to break this down for you, it's actually in, it follows the flow of the draft proposal. So actually, if you were taking a look at the draft proposal, you could follow along with me and just kind of go step by step. And basically, I'm going to be highlighting all of the most important parts of that draft proposal, because it is like 16 pages long. It's pretty complicated. And just keep in mind, this presentation is our very best effort of condensing this very complicated document down into a way that's digestible, so that you guys can get a good overview or feel of how it's going to function. So take a deep breath and let's go ahead and get into it. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and This black box keeps coming up. I'm going to go ahead and read off of this slide here, and this is the definition for an independent redistricting commission. So an independent redistricting commission, or IRC for short, is citizen-led and distinct from the legislature. It is not controlled by representatives of any political party, and it's created for the purpose of drawing state, legislative, and congressional district lines after every 10-year census. The IRC shall have the authority to draw, consider, and propose maps to the legislature for enactment. Maps shall conform to prescribed redistricting criteria, which we will go ahead and highlight later on in this presentation. And that includes the criterion that maps shall not provide a disproportionate advantage to any political party and are determined using accepted measures of partisan fairness. So why and how do we get an IRC? Well, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, our current process is controlled by the legislature and the governor, which unfortunately leaves the door open for a high potential for partisan gerrymandering. Additionally, there is no direct referendum process available to citizens in Wisconsin. So the way that we fix this is to first pass legislation to create an IRC, then work with the legislature on a constitutional amendment. Our goal is for the IRC to have full authority by the 2030 redistricting cycle. And again, we'll go into more detail on the constitutional amendment process later on in this presentation, but just note that a constitutional amendment can take quite a long time. It can take about 2 to 3 years, which we'll go over in the timeline. And the reason for that is basically because it needs to pass in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. So how is the IRC going to function? Well, firstly, there are strict eligibility rules to ensure independence of the IRC. And there are various eligibility rules outlined in the draft proposal, but just to name a few, you have to be a registered voter. And to try to keep things as nonpartisan as possible, we don't want anyone who is a current politician, has been in office within a certain amount of years, is an employee of a politician, or is a direct family member of a politician. And additionally, you are ineligible to serve in the IRC if you have donated a certain amount of money over the last 5 years. I believe it's $10,000 of the last 5 years. If you've donated a certain amount of money to any political party, you are also ineligible to serve on the IRC. And these are the various mechanisms in place we have to keep the IRC as nonpartisan as possible. There's going to be a rigorous selection and hiring process, which first includes mailing out 10,000 applications at random and also posting online on all major hiring websites. The reason for the random 10,000 applications, it's based on what we've seen other states do. And the reason for this is because we want to be able to hit areas of the state where people might not have very stable internet access. Maybe they're more likely to take a look at their mail, or just people that, don't go online very often. The makeup of the IRC, it will consist of 15 commissioners and 3 reserve commissioners. And the reason for this is, of course, that firstly, an odd number will help with the vote. We'll go into the, reserve commissioners a little bit later and talk about, how long these people are expected to serve on the IRC. But just note that the 15 commissioners would consist of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents or other affiliated. The 3 reserve commissioners would be similar. It would be 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and 1 independent. And just note that the current majority parties are Republican and Democrat, but of course that can change. So in the proposal language, we use the term simply majority party. So how long do commissioners serve? Commissioners serve for a period of 10 years, so until a new group is picked before the next census. The reserve commissioners are also on reserve for a period of 10 years. So the reserve commissioners can jump in if another commissioner's term ends. And I've also had some questions, where people asked, 10 years is a very long time. How do we know that 3 reserve commissioners is enough? We don't necessarily know that 3 reserve commissioners is enough, but if for some reason we exhaust all of those reserve commissioners, we can simply get more people on the reserve commission. So there are also job protections for commissioners, and an employer may not fire, threaten, or punish an IRC commissioner for serving on the IRC or attending meetings. And this is so that you can hold an additional job while you're also serving on the IRC. And a commissioner's term ends if, of course, they pass away, if they resign in writing, or if they're no longer able to meet basic rules for being a commissioner. For example, neglect of duty, misconduct, or inability to do the job. So how does the public get involved? Well, we really want this to be a citizen-led initiative, so this part where the public gets involved is really, really important. There will be 2 rounds of public hearings. The first round will occur before the maps are actually drawn. And during this round of public hearings, the IRC will teach the public how redistricting works, so a little bit of redistricting 101. They'll ask for input from people about their communities and local areas, and there will be at least 1 hearing in each region, plus a virtual option for those that cannot physically attend. Info shared at these meetings will help shape the first draft of the maps. And then the second round of public hearings will occur after the maps are actually drawn. In this round of public hearings, the IRC will share the proposed district maps for state assembly, senate, and Congress, so our legislative and congressional maps. They'll ask for the public for feedback on the maps, and then again, of course, there will be 1 hearing per region plus a virtual option. Any Wisconsin resident may submit maps or comments to the IRC, so anyone in this meeting right now will be able to submit their own maps, which will be subject to public record. The IRC must follow open meeting laws, and members may not talk about unfinished map ideas outside of public meetings. So where does the IRC get its money? Well, the IRC is going to be funded by the state. The legislature will provide the IRC money some sufficient to do its job. And what we mean by some sufficient is exactly how much money is needed. So no more, no less. Any leftover money must go back to the state after new redistricting maps are implemented. Again, because money is being allocated some sufficient. That money will be planned during the state's budget cycle, which occurs every 2 years. And that money will be used for paying commissioners for their work, hiring impartial experts and lawyers, hosting public hearings, publishing notices, and handling legal matters if needed or when needed. So how much do we expect to be allocated? Well, during the first round, we expect at least $4 million, and for future rounds, it would be the same amount as that previous cycle, although adjusted for inflation. And I know that $4 million might seem like a big ask. It's a lot of money, of course, but I just want to mention that it actually pales in comparison to the amount of taxpayer money that Wisconsin spent actually fighting our gerrymandered maps in court. So I think that $4 million is a great deal because it's going to be cheaper actually for taxpayers as opposed to fighting gerrymandered voting maps, and it's to secure fair maps for our state. The DOA is going to help manage payments and invoices. And for anyone that's not aware, the DOA is the Department of Administration. And just like it sounds, the DOA is the administrative backbone of the state. The IRC will be audited just like any other state agency, and any leftover money must go back to the state after new redistricting maps are implemented, again, because money is being allocated some sufficient. So here's the decision-making process. For most of the time, a simple majority will be needed to make decisions. So that includes 8 out of 15 commissioners need to agree to make a decision. However, for large decisions such as removing a commissioner or hiring or firing experts, we want at least 10 out of 15 commissioners to agree, which should include at least 1 Democrat, at least 1 Republican, and at least 1 minor party voter. However, for the final redistricting plan, we also need 10 out of 15 votes, but we want 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 minor party voters. And if they cannot agree, each member will submit their own map, which will then get ranked. the top-ranked map will be picked, and if it has support across the top-ranked map will be picked if it has support across party lines. And if no map meets the rule, one will be chosen at random. And this is kind of a worst-case scenario. This mechanism is in place based on how we've seen other states do this. And the reason for this is because you can imagine if you've put so much time into drawing these voting maps, you're not going to want one to be picked at random. However, even in this worst case scenario, that random map still needs to meet the strict criterion to be considered a fair map. So what happens next? The legislature will then review the final plan. They'll have 3 chances to approve it. And if they can't agree by August 15th, the Supreme Court will step in to decide. So what is that map adoption criteria? Well, the adoption criteria is that our voting maps must comply with the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes, including equal population. So every district should be roughly equal in population. It should comply with the Voting Rights Act and not disenfranchise minority voters. And it also must comply with the Equal Protection Clause. It also needs to comply with the Wisconsin State Constitution, which includes criteria such as nestled districts. So we need 3 contiguous assembly districts within each Senate district, which lines up pretty well because we have 99 assembly districts and 33 Senate districts. So it's pretty easy to have 3 assembly districts within, 3 Senate districts within each assembly district. And then, of course, all legislative districts must be composed of contiguous territory, which is defined as composed of physically adjoining territory. So they need to be contiguous, and they must be as compact as possible. So the districts need to be in as compact form as practicable, and the compactness will be scored mathematically using 3 different scores. We have those scores outlined in our draft proposal, and they're pretty complicated. They're kind of complicated mathematical equations that honestly I don't completely understand, but I will tell you that the general idea of these different mathematical equations is essentially to gauge how close to a circle each district is. So when districts are as compact as possible, they look as close to a circle as possible, meaning that you don't have these, long arms stretching out from one district, kind of like wiggling into another district. It looks as close to a circle as possible, and that's what those mathematical scores try to determine. Additionally, the districts need to be bounded by county, town, and ward lines, and again, should be roughly equal in population. The map should consider communities of interest, which means people who live in the same areas and share concerns. For example, perhaps people live in the same school district, they live in a similar area where people work within the same industry, or they have a similar culture. Communities of interest also refers to racial and language minorities as well. And keeping these groups together is very important because it makes sure that their voices are heard. When communities of interest are broken apart and kind of cracked into different voting districts, it dilutes their vote. So that's why we want to keep communities of interest whole whenever possible. Additionally, the maps cannot be based on politics or helping any candidate or elected official. The IRC will also attempt to keep cities, counties, and towns whole when possible, and they'll start with large areas first, like wards and villages, and then move on to larger ones. Political data will be used for the purpose of ensuring that any maps meet the established criteria, but that political data cannot be used to protect incumbents or give advantage to any political party. The maps will be used, checked using various partisan fairness scores. And again, we do have these scores recommended or outlined in our proposal. But I do want to mention that it is possible that the scores that we use could change by the time 2030 rolls around, because there's so many developments within this field that it's very possible. Sorry, I got a message that says to wrap up quickly. Sorry about that. We are actually right towards the end here, so we'll do Q&A and then wrap up. what was I saying here? Oh yeah, so the maps are going to be checked using partisan fairness scores, and we have those outlined in our draft proposal, but the partisan fairness scores could potentially change in the future if new, better ones are recommended. And preference will be given to maps that result in partisan fairness, of course. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me. Let's go ahead and do the Q&A section. But before that, I just want to speed run through this and say that, again, this is our timeline. We are going to be looking to pass a bill to establish an IRC and then move on to the constitutional amendment. I just want to mention that the reason we're not gunning for a constitutional amendment right away is just because bills can be passed more quickly to address an issue right away, whereas a constitutional amendment is going to take longer. So that's why we are going the statutory route first. But just note that the constitutional amendment is necessary to fully take the power to redistrict out of the hands of the legislature and also cement the IRC into our state constitution, making it more permanent and harder to reverse, which is why it's the pivotal last step in our plan to permanently kill the gerrymander in Wisconsin. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry that took a little long. Let's go ahead and take questions now.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Can you unpack the name gerrymander?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Can you unpack the name gerrymander?
Oh, yeah, sure. So gerrymander, it's actually named after a guy named Gary, not Jerry. So it's named after a guy named Eldridge Gary, who basically implemented the first gerrymander, I think in Massachusetts, like in the 1800s. And the district basically looked like a salamander. And so a political cartoon was drawn about this really crazy district that sort of looked like a salamander. And in that political cartoon, they called it the gerrymander after Eldridge Gary, which is why it's called gerrymandering. And I also just want to mention that I watched a John Oliver episode about gerrymandering way back when, which also explains the origin of the word gerrymandering. And there was just a really funny joke where he said, it's not named after a guy named Jerry, it's named after a guy named Gary, and it just shows that everything about gerrymandering is stupid and wrong.
Yes.
Next question.
Go ahead, it's unclear to me, how are the commissioners going to be selected for the and how do you ensure that in fact they're independent? Like I could say I'm independent. How do I get on the commission?
Yeah, that's a really great question because in Wisconsin we don't register by political party, so it's going to be more hard to determine whether people are being honest, right, by stating that they're a Democrat, Republican, or independent. So that's a really good point. We don't have this outlined in the draft proposal, but one of the things that we have discussed is potentially, checking social media, checking references as well. They will be required to include references on their applications. So just checking their social media and checking references to see how honest they are about their political affiliation.
How do you get on the commission? Who selects them?
Sorry?
Application process.
Oh, yeah.
Application process, yeah. So basically,
someone's got to pick them out. How do you do that?
Yeah. So the way that we have it written, what we have written into our draft proposal right now is the Department of Administration will oversee the hiring process because they're already, the DOA is already in charge of hiring various other state employees. So what they'll do is the DOA will be the ones to put out the job listings online and also send out the letters. And then people will respond to those job postings either like with a written application or in an online application. And then the DOA is going to go through and take a look at those various applications. We do actually have this specified in a lot of detail in the draft proposal. But there is a process for the DOA, removing applications that don't meet the criteria. And then additionally, the legislature will be able to strike a certain amount of applicants. And then towards the end of the process, basically we'll end up with, I believe it's about 280 applicants, and then those first 9 applicants, or what is it, 7, 6? The first 9 applicants are chosen at random. And then after those first 9 applicants are chosen, they receive a pool of other applicants, and then they choose the final commissioners.
Sounds complicated.
Yes.
It is. It's very complicated, and that's actually a shorter version of what it looks like. Because
So
if you
I
take a
wanna
look at
be
the
on the
draft
commission,
proposal,
I
it's
just
in a lot
make
more
an
detail.
application?
Yes.
Sorry.
If I want to be on the commission, how'd you do that?
You apply.
Yeah, I'm so glad you want to be on it. That's awesome. I hope everybody here will apply for the commission when it's time. So when you want to apply, you'll just go ahead and respond to the posting. So it's kind of like, I believe that we were discussing actually posting the applications on Indeed, like the major hiring websites. So if you've ever applied for a job on Indeed or online, it's going to be exactly like that. You fill out the application, you submit your references, kind of give your resume, CV, but you'll just need to, once the IRC is implemented, just watch out for those applications being advertised online or sent out via mail, or you can just make sure to take a look at their website since you know it'll be happening.
I have a question. The governor has called for a special session of the legislature on April 14th to consider his proposed constitutional amendment to prohibit partisan gerrymandering. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's a great thing, but this constitutional amendment is not going to change the actual process for the way the voting maps are drawn. It's not going to, again, take that process out of the hands of the legislature. So I don't think that, while I do think it's a good thing, it's not the ultimate fix for our maps mess, for our gerrymandering problem. We still need an independent redistricting commission in place to ensure that our maps are as fair as possible.
Thank you.
Why is that, Nicole?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Well, wouldn't by definition, if it's in the Constitution, the mechanism is almost irrelevant? That it's the outcome that is mandated in the Constitution?
Yeah, so the constitutional amendment would ban partisan gerrymandering, but there are still other ways to gerrymander, even if you have banned partisan gerrymandering. So, for example, you could crack and pack communities of interest like racial and language minorities. So you're not